couple of minutes with Sanjeev Sanyal would be what many were talking about, the processed reforms that the government essentially wants to bring in. And more interestingly, many would have heard about what Elon Musk has largely been talking about, bringing in the Government Efficiency Commission, which, ladies and gentlemen, India has already begun. And there you have Sanjeev Sanyal playing a pivotal role. For the first time ever, you have Sanjeev Sanyal talking about this and how exactly does the government really intend to take this forward. A devoted son of Mother India who has dedicated his life to narrating the fascinating story of Bharat. A noted economist, Sanjeev Sanyal is a historian on a mission to preserve our past and illuminate our future. His great-grandfather Nolinokho Sanyal was a freedom fighter. Born in Kolkata in 1970.
What I'm going to talk about today is about government efficiency. It's a hot topic these days because Elon Musk has promised a government efficiency commission in the US in the Trump administration. But let me say that here in India, we have been doing this for some years now, and we are going to ramp this up. So you need to know what we are attempting to do, first of all, and how we have already been doing some of these reforms. Now, the reforms that I'm going to talk about are a specific category of reforms called process reforms. Now, what on earth are process reforms? Now, most of you will be familiar with the term structural reforms, yeah? Whenever you read newspapers, you'll read about structural reforms. Now, these are reforms, the big picture reforms, that change the structure of something. So the original liberalization that happened in 1991, or the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, or the Inflation Targeting Framework, or GST, these are structural reforms because they fundamentally change the structure of whatever that activity happened to be. However, there is another category of reforms called process reforms. These are small nuts and bolts reforms that very often you may not read on the front page of the newspapers, but there are literally hundreds of them. These are the small reforms that don't necessarily change the structure of things, but make that, whatever activity it is, work a little bit more efficiently. This is, ladies and gentlemen, the government efficiency effort. And here in India, we have been now doing many of them one by one. But before I get into what we have been doing, let me give you a sense of what on earth these kinds of inefficiencies can be like. And I'm going to give you a somewhat humorous example of this. You see, India has about 3,700 odd nationally protected monuments. Yeah? Whenever you go to some of these old monuments, you'll see that blue board threatening you with all kinds of dire consequences if you happen to even touch anything near that monument. Well, those are the monuments I'm talking about, and we have 3,700 of them. So how did we get those 3,700 of them? Well, most of them, actually, interestingly, were inherited from the British colonial era, plus the ones that we inherited from the princely states. Now, a few got added along the way, but even today, most of the list of nationally protected monuments are the list which we got from the British. Now, nobody in these 77 years has actually gone in there and dug up what these are, should we be protecting them, and so on and so forth. So a couple of years ago, I began to go into this list and look at what these were. And we found that it was full of monuments that simply should not be protected. First of all, there were a few dozen that have simply gone missing. Nobody knows where they are. We have not known where they are for decades. Questions have been answered in Parliament about them, but they are still there in that list and nobody has delisted them. And then there are graves of obscure colonial era officials which simply have no historical value at all. Maybe they had value to the colonial government of that time. Nobody even remembers in which some of these cases who these people were, but they are still national monuments. They are still protected. By the way, the 100 plus 200 meter radius of, protection that has to be given to Taj Mahal is also applied to these obscure monuments. So let me tell you the story of one of them, which is right here in Delhi, near Kashmiri Gate. There was a statue of somebody called John Nicholson. Now, John Nicholson in 1858 was one of the British officials or generals who retook Delhi after the Great Rebellion. And when he did so, he did a really brutal job of it. I mean, he was brutal even by the standards of the time. He carried out several massacres. And a very grateful British government put up a statue of him right in front of Kashmiri Gate and put it in the list of national monuments. Fair enough. Then, of course, in 1947, we became independent. We didn't remove him from the list. But in 1960s, his birthplace, somewhere in Northern Ireland, asked for his statue. So this statue was wrapped up and sent off to Northern Ireland. But interestingly, the spot where his statue stood was not delisted from our national monuments. It continued to be the national monuments. Not only that, just across the road there is still a Nicholson cemetery. His grave is also a national monument and continued to be a national monument. And it's not just that it is in the list. You see, imagine Kashmiri Gate. It's a really densely packed place, and that 100 plus 200 meter radius in which all the ASI regulations are implemented continue to be implemented on this non-statue. So, as I said, a couple of years ago, I began to write a report about this. The good news is that finally the list of national monuments is being re-looked at. Some of these missing monuments are getting delisted, and just 6 weeks ago, the John Nicholson statue has finally been delisted from our list of national monuments. I'm telling you this story because the government of any country is full of this stuff, okay? Not just Indian government. It is true of every government in the world. In fact, of any large institution in the country, after a little while, they accumulate all of these things. So not surprisingly, Elon Musk has promised to create a government efficiency commission in the US. But here in India, as I said, we have been doing this kind of reforms step by step for quite some time. Like any government, we have large numbers of defunct organizations. They were created at some point in time. Perhaps at the time they were created, they had some utility. But unfortunately, it is quite rare that you shut down these kinds of institutions along the way. So a few years ago, again, an effort was made to try and find a list of these defunct organizations. Some of these are autonomous bodies. So I'm not here going to get into ministries and departments. That's a story in its own right. But I'm talking here about autonomous bodies. Now the first question that arises, how on earth do you find them? So the way to find them, in case any of you really want to look for them, is to look through the budget papers. They are now online, so it's easier to do. Go into each, don't look at the budget at a glance, that hides all of this stuff. Go and look in the real meat of those budget papers. Go ministry by ministry, and somewhere there in the footnote somewhere, in small print, you will find a list of all these institutions. There are some really genuinely obscure ones, let me assure you. Nobody knows why they exist. Perhaps at one point in time they had some use. But if you list them all out, the central government alone has over 800 of these autonomous bodies. Now, some of them, of course, are useful bodies. I mean, the SEBI or Reserve Bank of India, etc. We know what they do. But there are literally large numbers of them that exist that simply need to be shut down. Again, over the last few years, we have been systematically going around finding them, identifying them, making sure that genuinely don't play a role or can be merged. And we have been one by one merging them, shutting them down, and so on. So they have, as you may know about, All India Handicraft Board, All India Handloom Board, the Children's Film Society, Tariff Commission, and so on. Large numbers of bodies in the last few years have been closed. None of you noticed, did you? So clearly they weren't playing much of a great, important role. In this way, there are also large numbers of processes in government. Rules, regulations, laws that need to be cleaned up. Again, a very big effort is being done in this direction. So again, I'm going to tell you a story about something that existed till very recently. Many of you were in violation of this law, so I'm going to tell you about this. Well, till 2020, did you know that actually working from home was actually technically illegal? Yeah. Actually, it turns out that there were rules called the Other Service Providers rules, which the telecom ministry had. And it basically said that if you used any telecom service to work from a certain location, you had to take specific permission from the telecom ministry, and you would have to keep an EPA BX machine in your basement in order to use it. You had to tell a plan about how exactly you went about using the telecom system, and so on and so forth. These are outdated laws going back some decades, but they were there. Many of the people in the younger members of the audience may even not have a clue what on earth an EPA BX machine is. But you were supposed to have one in your basement. Now, I happened to discover this purely by chance. You see, when the lockdown was announced in March of 2020, the telecom ministry came up with a notification saying that the OSP requirements would be held in abeyance till the December 2020 in order to allow people to work from home. Now, I'm a suspicious sort of chap. When I look at a notification of this kind, I basically understand what it really means, which is that what the officials are trying to tell you is that in normal times, those outdated requirements actually do apply. That is what that notification actually meant. So I began to dig into this matter. And I very quickly discovered that while the average man on the street may not be being bothered by these notifications, if you happen to be a IT-enabled service or a BPO or some such information technology or telecom using service provider, company, and so on, then you had to really go and grovel in front of the telecom ministry officials. And you can imagine the amount of harassment, rent seeking, and other things that happened as a result of this. So I wrote a report and we began to unwind this. It required 2 rounds of effort, one in November 2020 and then later again in 2021. But we finally got rid of this. And guess what happened? The later NASSCOM did a survey in 2021 to ask from the BPO, IT-enabled software, other sectors, how many of those companies had benefited from the getting rid of this. And it was discovered that 92% of BPO, IT-enabled services had their compliance requirement reduced radically. 92%. 28% of them said that their compliance requirement had gone down 50%. Simple change, dramatic improvement in government efficiency of the economy. Let me give you another example of something that has also already happened. I don't know how many of you have ever attempted a company voluntarily. I'm not talking about insolvency and bankruptcy. I'm talking about shutting down a company voluntarily. 90% of companies that are shut down in any country in any year are usually for voluntary reasons. Somebody was running a company, their kids don't want to run it, so they want to shut it down. There's no, it's not like it's going bankrupt, there's no case against it, there's nothing bad, they just want to shut it down. And if we've attempted to do this, you will know, it used to take years. You had to first go ministry by ministry, tax, labor, blah, 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 and take an NOC, no objection certificate. And for reasons that are not clear, because it was not there any notification, you had to do it in a certain sequence. And then when you had succeeded in getting all the NOCs, you then had to go to the registrar of companies and give in all the NOCs on the paperwork. And then they were supposed to put out an advertisement in a newspaper to tell the world that you wanted to shut this company down. In case somebody still had some needed to be paid, or they had a case, something, they could raise the issue. If they didn't, then you could shut the company down. Fair enough. It turns out it used to take years to do this. On average, you would take 500 days, but that is the average. There were companies that, there were cases which would go on for 10 years and you wouldn't be able to shut down your company. Again, this is when I was still in finance ministry. During COVID, in fact, I did this research. We looked at the entire process. First of all, we discovered there is no particular reason why you needed to get those NOCs in sequence. You could have them parallelly done, right? No genius to understand this. Then, when you went to the ROC stage, we realized something very interesting. It turned out that the biggest delays actually happened because even after you'd done all the paperwork, the registrar of companies would take their own sweet time to put up the advertisement. Let's say they very often needed to be coaxed to put out that advertisement. So, this was clearly something we could solve. So what has happened is that in May of 2023, this process has been now completely put online. Go to our website. These are for those companies being shut down voluntarily under the Companies Act, which is the bulk of the companies. You put out all your details online. The system itself sends the emails out to different departments for an NOC. Okay? If in 21 odd days they don't come back, then the system itself generates an NOC and sends a list to the registrar of companies. That list then has to be put into the advertisement. If for some reason you don't want to do it, then the official who wants to take a name out has to give a reason in writing why they want to not put that company out in the advertisement. What has the result of this been? Remember, this has now gone on since last year, May. This is now we have fair amount of data. It turns out that shutting down a company in India now just takes, on average, 90 days. We're actually more efficient than Singapore now. So these are examples of stuff we are already done. So here are a few more, or at least one, I don't know how we're doing for time, but at least one that I will give you an impression how we can do more of these. And by the way, as we are becoming better and better at doing them, we are accelerating this as well. So here is something that I'm already working on. All of you, when you buy products, you will see that there is a label on it, yeah? Now, there are also a large number of rules and regulations on weights and measures, which are called legal metrology. Now these rules, regulations on labeling, on weights, measures, etc., are a major cause for harassment for anybody in the supply chain, whether you're a small-time manufacturer, or you're somewhere in the wholesaler, or somewhere in the supply chain. And as you can imagine, other than traffic rules, my guess is it may well be the second largest source of rent seeking, small level rent seeking through the economy. So this is something I've written about before as well. But it's a large topic, but here is one bit that I think we can solve with the greatest of ease. Labels. You see, first of all, there are a large number of labeling laws. I mean, understanding India's labeling laws itself is a non-trivial task. But these rules keep changing all the time. And they change randomly, okay? Just when you think you've figured it all out, they will change it. Instead of writing grams as G, you have to write it GM. Not all of them make any logical sense, but this is what happens. If you don't comply with it, there are grave consequences that are threatened to you. Now, I'm not even getting into the contents of the labeling laws. The problem really is the following, is that you never know when these changes will be announced. And now when you do labels, anybody who's attempted to do this, will know that you have to do them in large batches. You don't do one label, you say let's say you're producing 10,000 of something. It doesn't mean you just do 10,000 labels. You probably have printed a few lakh labels and you paste them on and put them on as those batches go out. So supposing you have done one really big batch and the next day the labeling law changes the font in which you're doing the label, the whole thing's gone. It can even be worse if actually the goods have gone into the supply chain. Now you have to go and claw it back from somewhere, some shop somewhere, and bring it all back, relabel it. Huge amount of wastage. So a simple change that is being now proposed. Let's simply announce whatever change in the label. I'm not even questioning the label, the change, whatever changes you want to make or the quality of those. Just make sure that those changes are only done twice a year. On the 1st of July and the 1st of January. That's all. Imagine how much benefit there will be to the entire system of this very simple change. Everybody doing any kind of manufacturing, labeling, etc. knows that on the 1st of July and the 1st of January, we will know what the new are. All you need to do is to keep your supply chain light. Don't print anything on the 31st of December, and by and large, you are done. Simple change, no cost to the system at all. And yet, imagine the ease of doing business this shows. I hope you've got a sense of what this process reform effort is all about. As I said, structural reforms are important, but very often, these process reforms are ignored. Unless you happen to be from that particular sector, you may never hear about some of these changes. But in those sectors, it makes a massive difference. More often than not, the changes are very simple to do. You will not get complicated debates on Republic on whether this should or shouldn't be done, because very frankly, these are purely efficiency changes. And I think we can do hundreds of them, and the benefits of doing them, the cumulative impact of that, ladies and gentlemen, is something that will eventually get us to Viksit Bharat. Thank you very much.